was coming off of work, and I remember it being a beautiful day, and I remember him telling me on the way to work, because he worked the night before, that he was going to go get the car's oil changed.
Yeah, he's a firefighter.
He's a fireman. He was working in Brooklyn at the time. And like I said, a lot of misinformation was going on, and I was told that they did not send any firemen into the World Trade Center because they thought it was dangerous. So that day, not hearing from my husband, I was under the assumption that everything was okay, even though there was no phone contact. I had worked in the World Trade Center for many years before I became a teacher, so I knew a lot of people from Dean Witter, where I used to work, that might have been in the building that day. So I was worried for them, and I was worried about my husband. What happened was I did not hear from my husband up until maybe 7 o'clock that night, when I got a phone call from one of the lieutenants that he was in the hospital at St. Vincent's in Manhattan, that he had been in Building 5 when it collapsed, and that he was okay, but at that point they weren't letting anybody in and out of the city. So his aunt, who is a nun in Manhattan, who runs a homeless shelter, was able to walk from Harlem, which is pretty high up in Manhattan, down to St. Vincent's Hospital to visit him and bring him something to eat and to check on him. And she was able to call and give us an update.
Please, may I interrupt you? Now imagine, I know you all have seen pictures of Manhattan. Imagine the whole entire islands of Manhattan was shut. You could not get over any bridges. You could not drive. You could not drive through the tunnel. No one was allowed access to Manhattan at that point. I'm sorry, I think this is pretty amazing.
And so what happened was my little boy was only, I believe at that time, maybe one. So my parents came out from the end of Long Island to pick him up because I was afraid that, you know, like Ms. Amato said, we didn't know if more planes were going to crash. So anyway, the next day the fire department picked me up, and it was very surreal because there was no cars on the major parkways, which are usually congested with traffic. When we got to Manhattan, we went through the tunnel. We were the only car in the tunnel. There were Army and military and military vehicles, and they allowed us to pass through. I went to the hospital, and I just remember hundreds and hundreds of photos up around the buildings of people who were looking for loved ones. And I remember the crowds of people outside the hospital holding pictures with a panicked look in their face, looking for their loved ones, hoping that they would be in the hospital. And the sad thing was, although the hospitals were prepared for many, many victims, there were, injured people, there weren't a lot. So when I got to the hospital, there was a lot of television and media there. I went up, my husband wasn't supposed to come out of the hospital. He checked himself out, he had a concussion. As we walked out of the hospital, the news cameras were flashing, and a lot of people wanted to interview him, and he did not want to talk to the media. They wanted him to come up with New Morning New York, all these different talk shows, and he was really in shock at the time. But to make a long story short, the next day he went down to dig, and he worked many, many tours digging through the rubble, and he lost a lot of friends, and he went to Staten Island for the recovery where they were looking for remains. And how has my life changed? My life has changed because my husband's life changed. He saw and did things that a lot of people would never experience again in their lives. He had to bury a lot of friends. He also felt guilty that he survived when other people didn't survive. And it's been 13 years, and he's, still not the same person. But what I think everyone needs to know is that the victims of 9/11 not only died that day, but they've been dying ever since, because a lot of the recovery workers have come down with various illnesses and forms of cancer, and they have died as a result of working down at the World Trade Center site. And at this point in time, my husband has a serious illness in his lungs, which his lung capacity has diminished, which means he has trouble breathing now. So that he's probably going to be put out of the fire department at some point this year. He has friends that have cancer, different stages, and this was all because they worked in the rubble and all these different locations where there were all the toxic chemicals and dust and things like that. And he fortunately wore his mask. At the time, they told everybody it was okay, you know, there was nothing to worry about. A lot of people did not wear masks, but he wore his mask while he was down there. And even though he had the mask on, he still got sick. So, you know, that's how my life changed.
And, you know, right after that, don't forget, we had no television. The television antennas and transformers were all on the Twin Towers. So we had only certain stations, even though you might have cable and things like that, you only had certain local stations that were operating. And we did not have regular programming for days, maybe even weeks after this happened. There was nothing else but this on the television. There was no music on the radio. Everything was about this. Every station that you turned on. So there was no music, there was no television, and everybody had that terrible look on their face. I thought I was never going to smile again. That's how I felt. And I didn't know anyone down there, but because I felt very vulnerable and I thought that something else was definitely going to happen, and I also felt so sad because all of the images was what Mrs. Ingalls was talking about. People who couldn't find their loved ones standing on corners, praying, hoping that their loved one wasn't killed in the collapse, but that maybe somehow was in a hospital. And they would interview these people, so many, and they were so distraught and so unhappy, and they were showing me pictures of people that they loved, saying, you know, if you see this person, he's my uncle, you know, here's his name, he has 2 children, please let us know. And unfortunately, many of those people who were walking around with those signs and those pictures never found their loved ones until, as Mrs. Ingalls said, their remains were found on Staten Island.